Prynawn da pawb, and welcome back to our annual conference. I'm really excited about the session that we've got ahead of us now. For the last few years, I've been watching with keen interest the Museum of Homelessness and their amazing work that they do within communities and to pay tribute to people experiencing homelessness. The COVID pandemic got in the way of us inviting them previously, but I'm absolutely delighted that they're joining us here today at our annual conference. We're joined by Jess and Matt Turtle, who are co-founders of the Museum of Homelessness. And Jess hails from Wales, so has a real connection to us here on this side of the border. Established in 2015 and run by people with direct experience of homelessness, the Museum of Homelessness makes tomorrow's history by building the National Collection for Homelessness. They take direct practical action in support of the community. They fight injustice and they educate on homelessness by working with artists and creatives to make unforgettable art exhibitions and events. Many of you may be aware of the Dying Homeless Project, which remembers the stories and the lives of people who unfortunately die whilst experiencing homelessness. And they've certainly hit the headlines with that, shining a really important light on those issues. And they've also recently published a report about research into homelessness, racism and xenophobia. So I'd really encourage you to listen carefully to this session and check out their website afterwards and learn more about their brilliant work. So that's enough from me. I'm now going to invite Jess and Matt to join us and deliver their presentation. But please do put questions into the Q&A section in the chat bar and they'll have time to answer questions at the end of the session. Thanks very much, Jess and Matt.
Prynawn da, and thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone at Cymorth Cymru for having us. As Katie said, I am originally from Cardiff, and it therefore feels like a little bit of a homecoming. I'm always happy to be back in Wales, even if it's virtually. So it's really great to be here today, sharing the work of Museum of Homelessness with you all.
I'm Matt. I'm the other co-founder of Museum of Homelessness, and I definitely have a connection to Wales as well through studying there. My parents met in Wales, so it's really special for both of us, right, Jess?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this session, we hope it will be useful to talk with you all a little about our approach and how it's rooted in community practice, how it's rooted in the history of the homelessness sector, and also a theme going through the session will be trauma and how survivor-led work can be really effective. So I'm a complex trauma survivor, and I believe that there are wisdoms that come from trauma as well as a lot of difficulty, and so we've sort of designed the session around that. But before we start with that, we're really tired and excited and happy because last night Museum of Homelessness won Exhibition of the Year at the Museum and Heritage Awards, which is like our industry sort of like Oscars or BAFTAs or something like that. So it was really massive for us to win that, and we thought we'd open up the presentation by sharing some information on the exhibition that won, because we think it kind of defines what Museum of Homelessness is and how we approach things.
Yeah, definitely. It gives us a handy opportunity to explain the Museum of Homelessness in a pithy way, because we're based in London, but we don't have a building. You can't visit the Museum of Homelessness. So over the last 7 years since we were set up, we've done a variety of projects and a variety of exhibitions, and a lot of direct work with people, getting people involved who have been homeless, who are homeless in all sorts of different ways. And winning this award for this exhibition, Secret Museum, that was the name of the show, was a really huge thing for us, because during the pandemic, we repurposed the museum into something completely different. We were on the streets, we were in temporary accommodation, we campaigned for hotel rooms, we even set up the museum outside the Home Office to protest far-right activity in relation to COVID hotels being targeted. So it was 2 years unlike any other, and I know people here can really relate to that. And so Secret Museum was our way of telling a story about homelessness and the pandemic, and tell a story a bit about our community, about community togetherness. And I hear what Katie said before the session, just, the first session of the day was about how tired everyone is, but how much work has been done as well. And we've really seen that across the board. So Museum of Homelessness does that direct work, but we also do that storytelling work of a museum.
So this image here is of the Secret Museum, which we put in some tunnels underneath Waterloo Station. And people, we wanted to give people a sense, not only to hear the stories when they got there of the objects, which are sort of performed theatrically, but also to give people a sense of what it was like organising on the ground in the pandemic. We basically didn't tell anyone the location of the museum, and we hid clues in the streets surrounding it. Very historic homelessness sites as well, that the audience had to find their way around the surrounding streets. And you can see here a tea station being set up underneath one of the railway arches. On the left, you can see one of the donors hearing his story performed. And it actually is a story which began in Cardiff, because he was originally from the valleys, and he's ended up in London. We use the urban fabric, like we used a phone box, probably the last working phone box in London, where they had to answer the phone and get a clue from that.
Yeah, you're seeing some unusual things here, bubbles and rainbow-coloured sweatbands. And the reason why these are there is because these are the objects that were donated to the Museum of Homelessness Secret Museum exhibition. These are the objects that people said, this object tells a story about what happened in homelessness and the pandemic. And we use those objects to guide people through the streets en route to the actual Secret Museum bunker that you saw in the earlier slide. I've just been told my signal was a little bit ropey here and there, so I'll switch our camera off. Hopefully that's a bit better. Where was I, Jess?
So we were just talking about the objects that were given. So the bubbles, for example, was someone who went out and did a breakfast run all the way through the pandemic, bringing bubbles and joy as well as food to people who were left out on the streets. And then the rainbow sweatbands were an object that was given by a Polish migrant who was an activist but also experienced homelessness. And every single member of the audience was sent one of these rainbow sweatbands to wear to the show to identify each other, but also to show solidarity with our LGBTIQ homeless community. So that we used the objects in quite creative ways, and it was a group method. So all of the way that this was designed was people in our community experiencing homelessness who decided how to put the objects in the streets. And I think the reason that we're starting with this is to show what we mean when we say Museum of Homelessness has been set up to show that survivors of complex trauma and survivors of homelessness have strength, have resilience, have creativity. We have joy in the community. We have love. We have compassion. And it's really important that the museum shares this side of our community, because everyone here who works in the sector will be aware of it, but the general public might not be so aware that there's this different side. Like, homeless people are not like victims simply to be pitied. So that's a really important part of our job. And we're doing this as a group of survivors and activists and creators in the middle of a really difficult time globally, but also in the UK. We have the hostile environment for homeless migrants. We have, as was mentioned in our intro, we're very, very sorry to say that deaths of people experiencing homelessness have spiked 80% over 2 years. We're looking at a crisis of trauma, and it's a trauma that's held not only in the homeless community, but more widely, because we're looking at a global crisis of trauma. And we're talking about structural trauma that has come from colonialism, that has come from the worst impacts of capitalism. And you see it all over the world with what's happening in the environment, what's happening socially and politically. So, and what happens with structural trauma when this is a situation that we're living in? It also unfairly, it tends to be pushed on to groups that are already marginalised. So the trauma from society gets heaped upon people who are homeless or disabled people, Black people, minority ethnic people, or in settler nations, Indigenous communities. So this is something that we're in the middle of, and we're trying to find solutions to through our work.
So given all of that, how do we respond as people who work in this field, as community-based organizations, as charities, etc.? And we want to try and do two things to show how we've done a little bit of that, talking about different things we've done, and that's to share the wisdoms of history and community, and about how we can heal together, to see how we can improve things. And secondly, we want to talk about our way of working, which is survivor-led and which carries on a great tradition of people who are affected by homelessness setting up stuff. And we think that's really important in the context of today's session. And our community is really influenced by the history of other communities, ways of working, a sort of communalism as method. It goes right back into the mid-20th century, and organizations like the Simon Community and others, which we're just about to talk about, really set a standard. And it was this communalism as method as opposed to sort of managerialism as method, which came in the 90s. And we've tried to revive some of that in our work. And what were some of these other communities, Jess? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, one of the communities that we know about from our work and is the Wallach Clifford community, which there may be people here today who work for the Wallach now. It's a very large homelessness charity now in Wales. But this is the Wallach in the early 1980s in the main house in Splot on Broadway. And this was a community which had tremendous heart. You know, this was a community where people were accepted exactly as they were. There was an open door policy. Everyone was welcome. It wasn't a place where there were targets or there was move on. It was a place where people could really land, rest, and begin to heal from trauma together. It was a place of togetherness. And how do we know that this was a place that was like that? We know I know because I lived it. That was my family. I was born there. The baby in the bottom left picture is me. And my parents were community organisers who set up the Wallach. They were also homeless. Like, my dad had been on the streets for decades, and mainly in London, and he'd been involved with the Simon community there, the founder of which, Anton Wallach Clifford, he named his community in Cardiff after. That's where the name comes from. So, you know, this was a remarkable place to grow up, and it was a place that there aren't really places like that anymore. We're trying to bring something of that spirit into the work of the museum, because we believe it really works for people. Now, I'm not going to rose tint it. You know, we're talking about homelessness. It's hard. We're talking about immense trauma in the community. I have a very high ACEs score, which I know that you've done a session on today, I think, or at some point during the conference. You know, so it is very hard. There are challenges and trauma in growing up homeless and all the complexities that go with that. But more so, there is beauty, there is joy, and there is care in the community, and there are people doing their best. So we feel like there are wisdom this trauma actually that we can apply to our work today that far outstrip any of the bad things that I experienced. And what we're going to share today is those wisdoms of trauma. Now we know now in 2022 that they're not just community wisdoms, because what we've done in our work with the museum is we've got in touch with the science. We've explored the science around this, and there's huge breakthroughs happening at the moment in multiple fields, psychology, neuroscience, immunology, that can really help us understand what trauma is. And what we found is that this science actually proves and affirms the community wisdoms. You know, the science lines up. So we're going to use a little bit of that in our session today.
Yeah, really, just to touch on that very quickly, it's some of the things we're referring to are things like the work of Stephen Porges and Deb Dana in relation to the evolution of the autonomic nervous system and how that developed polyvagal theory. We're thinking here about Dick Schwartz's internal family systems theory, for example, and there's so much more, in particular work that we have done with Dr. Lasana Harris on dehumanized perception and Dr. Gabor Mate's work on trauma. Jess, you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I've got the real privilege. Dr. Gabor Mate, if people haven't read this book, When the Body Says No, Also in the realm of The Hungry Ghost, which is about addiction. I really recommend you read it. When I read these books, everything in my life fell into place and suddenly made sense. And now I have the immense privilege of training in his method for healing, which is called compassionate inquiry. Where I'm 9 months into the year's professional training for that, and it's been life-changing. We also, as Matt said, we worked with a world-class neuroscientist, Dr. Lasana Harris. His work really interested us because he's looked at the way in which people's brains don't activate properly when they meet someone who is homeless. So the medial prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain which allows us to be human together and to connect. And his studies at Princeton had proved that this part of the brain doesn't light up when people meet someone they believe to be an outsider in an out-group. Now, we thought the ramifications of that are fascinating for understanding why there's societal divides. And it shows you how trauma manifests in the brain of people in wider society, which further then makes the lives of people who are homeless more difficult. If you remember what I said in the start of the thing about trauma operating on society, this is how it manifests in our neural pathways. So we worked with Lasana for 18 months to see if the museum's work on storytelling could mitigate this effect of dehumanization. And we ran like live experiments with him and our audiences, and it does work, you know. So it's all about the creativity and the connection that can come through the arts and that can come through making community together and inviting people to experience that with you, that can really heal some of these stigmas and divisions that we have.
So we're going to move into the sort of main bit of the session, which is 4 wisdoms that we want to share, directly derived from the science and from Dr. Marte's work, and invite you not really just to listen, but we're going to try and create pockets where you can kind of reflect on this, so it's not just us talking at you. And you literally want to start with that now. So we'll move on to the first wisdom, which is disconnection from self and others.
These are like the wisdoms of trauma from Gabor Mate. He says that trauma does 4 things to a person. And the first thing that it does is it disconnects us from ourself, from our authentic self, and also enables us to like not be able to connect so well with others.
Yeah, it's I mean, what's really important to say about disconnection from self is that it's not actually about the original traumatic event. It's actually about what happens afterwards. That disconnection is something which shows up in your life throughout your life, but it's actually something that's keeping you safe. It's actually keeping you out of difficulty. But it's sort of paradoxical because disconnection is obviously cannot always be framed as a positive thing. So you've got these 2 contrasting things that we really need to delve into. But what does that actually look like, Jess?
Well, so in this presentation, I'm going to use my own experiences as an example where we need to illustrate any points about complex trauma. What you'll find with Museum of Homelessness work is like we try and support people to tell their own stories in the way that they want to and feel safe with. So we won't tell people stories for them. We might describe an artwork, but we won't tell other stories for them. But I can take my experiences and share them. So for me, the disconnection from self as an adult has manifested in many ways, like eating to numb my feelings, misusing drugs and alcohol. Although I'm 2.5 years completely sober now, which is a big milestone. And even things like addiction to smartphone and those notifications on Twitter, right? So things like that will resonate with a lot of people. And that's the kind of thing that disconnection can look like. So before we talk about what a museum might do about this disconnection and how we try and get around it as a community and work with it, we wanted to just give you like a minute to consider this first wisdom of trauma and consider someone's behavior. Like just write it down just for yourself. There won't be any sharing. It might be someone you love or someone that you've worked with, or yourself, and that behavior which might have seemed irrational, and just consider and reflect as to whether it could be reframed as some form of disconnect, some sort of protective impulse that the person has that has kept them safe in the past. So we'll just give you a minute for that. Okay, now hopefully that was just a useful little moment of reflection. Surprise, surprise, the antidote to disconnection is connection. Right, it's like the old saying, you know, connection is the opposite of addiction. It won't be a surprise to anyone, but actually doing it can be like more tricky or more complicated than in today's society.
Well, I think so, but everybody's very hard pressed to do things very quickly, and we an example of that is this event here. In a way, it happened last April. It's at the Whitechapel Gallery, and actually we secured some funding to for an activist museum award to share more about our anti-racist work. Katie referred to some of it actually in the opening section. And we wanted to do an issues-based event, unpacking things about the hostile environment and so forth. But it quickly became very clear that as we reached out to people, that no one wanted to do that. We just wanted an event to actually take a day off activism. So that's what happened. That was our recharge day, wasn't it, Jess?
Yeah, that was the recharge day, and that's a picture taken at the end of the day, and you can see we were all much replenished. And it's just everyone just wanted a simple like day off activism, and it was really lovely. But the magic ingredient was this artwork here with Jacob V. Joyce, who's an associate artist that we're very privileged to work with. And they created this spaceship as a way for people to reconnect with each other, with their bodies, because it's a physical kind of workshop that you do. The spaceship can only be activated together physically. Is for people to reconnect with their own stories and heritage, and the illustrations that Jacob has printed onto the spaceship are some of those narratives. And it's a way of people connecting to the land as well, which is another sort of thing that people are alienated from. And we really love this idea that Jacob came up with when we commissioned them to make a piece of like post-pandemic artwork. And it's like an ongoing thing that we can take it into schools. We can do workshops with the community in a really, really effective way of people connecting. And we just wanted to put that in there as an example of how art can bring some magic and it can accelerate connection in a way we wouldn't be able to do without the artists and without that artwork.
Yeah, and it's a very different direction, isn't it, from, I guess, what I was getting at before, which is like when you have funder expectations or targets to meet, but actually the direction people want to go in is very, very different. How do you reconcile those two things? And I think staying authentic and true to that the communities, our communities' wishes at that time is what's really, really important. And I think what kind of frames this wisdom really, and how you respond and work around it. Yeah.
So the second pillar or true wisdom from trauma is that trauma makes you have a lack of flexibility in emotional responses. And that is like fairly self-evident. But you know, so for me, it will be that I will always go to fight mode if my nervous system gets activated. A defensive mode is one that's kept me safe in the past, but is now inappropriate in my life as it is now. So I'm doing, I do a lot of work with that now. And the theory is,
well, I guess the theory is it can be very, very varied, but it effectively means that when your nervous system is go into an emotional reaction that's almost involuntary. So This is accessing parts of the brain like the limbic system, and many of you will probably know this. And so it's about a lack of emotional response flexibility is about widening that, really. And so retraining neural pathways, for example, and not falling back on old pre-programmed plans. And as trauma survivors, we have a window of tolerance that we stay within, and if we can stay with it and widen it, we can have greater response flexibility.
Now, we've seen in our work like ways to do that. We've developed ways to do that in our work, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But we just wanted to take another like 30 seconds just for you to maybe reflect on this idea as well. And they may not be new ideas to you, but I think it's always a good moment to just keep on. It's a practice. Just keep on thinking about, because what we see quite often in homelessness work is that people are blamed for making these perceived bad choices. Like leaving accommodation is a key one, or, you know, maybe relapsing, and or like it's called refusal to engage, which I kind of think is a nonsense. When you think of it through a trauma lens, you know, those things that can feel frustrating about someone's choices can be reframed as an act of survival, because that nervous system has kicked in. People have gone straight to an emotional response, like I said with my temper before. And it's not like the idea of choice is very different. So if you just want to take 30 seconds maybe to consider maybe the last time that you might have perceived someone made a bad choice, or it might be resonant for you in one of your own emotional responses, and just think about whether it might be a trauma response as opposed to you know, other reasons.
Just take that 30 seconds now.
Okay. So how we get around this is that we make resistances, right? So in my example of being a very much of having a fighting spirit as a result of some of my experiences, I now channel that into Museum of Homelessness. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why Museum of Homelessness has quite a creatively resist culture, and we're quite a campaigning organisation. I think I've met other people who have similar stuff, and we come together to fight the injustice. And it's more of a healthy way of doing it than in some ways where I used to lose my temper, perhaps, without going into any stories. And I found that because the museum is a way to articulate my own trauma without having to shout and without having to actually fight, and expanding my emotional flexibility. This image here is of an amazing artist, David Tovey, who is one of our associate artists. And this is a show, a giant show which had like 170 volunteers and participants involved, that he made. It's called Man on Bench Fairy Tale, and it's made in homage to the time a man sat down on a bench next to him and saved his life, basically, when he was at rock bottom. And he replays this, and he makes costumes out of rubbish, and there's a giant fashion show, and this one was a grime opera with like Choir with No Name involved, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And that's just a way that David articulates creatively his pain, and it's a really, really effective way of like widening your emotional responses from trauma.
Yeah, I mean, just to elaborate on that, I mean, I think just to focus on one group in this very populated image right at the front here, that's the Choir with No Name Liverpool. There's a new group, I think, in Cardiff that's just been set up. They're an amazing organisation who come together, people, trauma survivors, people who've been through the issues, getting together to sing. And they sort of were the finale of the show, really. And singing is an incredible thing. It's an incredible activity. Activating vagal activity, vibration in the chest, help heart to reset, the long out breaths tones your vagal nerve and it slows your heartbeat down, and the connection that you have with your fellow singers, the timing, the reciprocity of connection. It activates the neurons, mirror neurons in your neocortex, rewiring neural pathways and bringing you to compassion and joy, right? And it's that face-to-face connection. I think what did you say about vagal activity singing? It's like the whole system resets or something.
According to the polyvagal theory, singing is the only human activity that incorporates every single like biological thing that you need to reset the vagus nerve and bring you back into your window of tolerance. So it's like nature's gift. All cultures sing, and there's a reason for that. It's because it helps us to stay social, stay connected, and feel safe. So yeah, shout out for the arts and for singing in particular, for really enabling trauma survivors to come together and overcome, and creatively resist. That's what it's all about. The third one is about our worldview being shaped. So if we've been through a lot of really hard things, then we can often feel unsafe, and our worldview will be shaped by that. So for me, for many, many, many years, I always had this sort of conviction that ultimately people would harm each other. That was sort of like the human's default setting, was kind of selfishness and stuff like that, which is also a very 20th century belief when you look at Freudian theory and stuff like that, because Freud was carrying his own trauma, and that's very much shaped our Western beliefs, but that's a whole other talk. But my worldview was like that until I found Museum of Homelessness community and we started making work together, and until I began this kind of healing journey. I now believe and know that there is hope and there can be joy and compassion and love at the heart of every human. So I think that that it's just really worth considering. What Gabor says is that our worldview is subjective, and not only that, we can heal from it. Like, we can change our core beliefs, and we can do that by making a better world. And the great privilege and gift that Museum of Homelessness has given me is this ability to come together with people who have been through something similar. We've all got different experiences of homelessness, but we all have common ground, and together we make a better world, because the world that we experience so far let us down, and there's such a power in being able to shape that. And that's what we saw in the community movement that I grew up in. That was trauma survivors and homeless people making their own spaces to try and make something better, and that echoes down through the ages to our work today. How would you go about that, practically speaking, Matt?
I think some of the things that we're saying here, I guess, are trying to do a take on trauma, which is, I guess, beyond a sort of just a focus on individuals. And I think some of the discussions around that emphasize safety, strengths-based approaches to working with people, in making sure that volunteers and staff and in services are more trauma-informed. But making a better world is really about restructuring kind of everything you do to demonstrate different ways of doing things in such a way that trauma isn't really distilled or atomized into one part of the organization, but it's kind of reflected in other parts of the organization. So this can involve things like devolving power, and how you're actively devolving power, and what are the checks on leadership. In particular, with the slide here, it can involve our own organizational policy, which is that we have flat pay policy for the organization, where everyone is paid the same. And that was evolved with our core group over many, many months, our core group of people who we work with on a regular basis, who shape the museum's strategic and creative direction. And other things as well, like our consensual governance approaches, and co-producing the contracts that we will have with our artists and freelancers, co-producing works like the Man on Bench fairy tale Creative Resistance that we just shared with you. And in thinking of things like Secret Museum, the objects that we talked about, so the rainbow sweatband, etc., people who donate those objects to us have the power of veto and can take them out of the museum at any time. And that's very important, because very often we see stories being instrumentalized or being taken out of context, and this gives that person the power.
Yeah. So think of it as like a stick of rock. We hope that the trauma-informed approach runs right through the organisation, and we always say that we believe that if we really mean it, then it better show up in our finances. So that's why the community designed our terms and conditions when we became an employer, etc. So just to run through that list again, because we're going to want you to take a minute in a moment and think about any action you could take in your role or try and influence in your organisation to devolve power a bit more. So we have the flat pay and terms and conditions designed by the community and reviewed annually. We have checks on power for Matt and my role as leaders. We have the consensual governance, and particularly our chair, Sharon Heel, is amazing. She applies a feminist leadership to the board, even though obviously we're a charity, so we meet all of our obligations, but we try and do things a little bit differently. We co-produce all of our contracts so people can write their own contracts. And we have that power of veto where people's stories are not exploited, particularly not for fundraising. So if you want to take a moment, just a minute, and just think about, is there anything you could do? Or is there anything you might want to share with others that you're already doing that is really great? Is there something to be proud of there in terms of co-production? I know there's a lot of great work happening in the sector. So just 1 minute, we'll let you know when we'll start again. Okay, so that was the last reflection moment for our session. We've just got our final wisdom to look at, and then hopefully we'll have time for any questions or reflections or any sharing that people want to do. The final that Gabor taught us from our community is that one of the things that trauma does is makes it very, very hard to be in the present moment. And so basically how that shows up in your body is that often our bodies will be wired so that, and our nervous system is wired so that a small trigger can make our body think it's back in that trauma. And if you've got complex trauma, then it's just like one thing after another. Or you might have another way it plays out. So that's being stuck in the past, like literally your body's physically stuck in the past. Another way it can play out is that you might have control. Feel this need to control the future as much as possible. This is certainly true in my case. I have very controlling tendencies because there's a need to try and make things safe. So then we're either catastrophizing or we're in the future trying to control it, and we're just not in the present. Now, we believe that being together in community and being present is so important, and we weave that into as much of our work as possible. Learning to be present together is a really key thing of how we try and heal, even in really difficult circumstances. Matt, do you want to say anything about this image?
So you're looking at an image of Trafalgar Square, the steps of St. Martin in the Fields, and where they hold an annual memorial service for people who've died homeless. We've not really said very much about the Dying Homeless project, which Katie mentioned in the beginning, which is our monitoring and memorial project to remember people around the UK who have died whilst homeless. And we wanted to touch on a lot of the different things that we do, but this is a huge part of what we do. And I think it's important because it's learning to be present, not just for those moments of creative resistance or celebration, but also in the really difficult moments, and acknowledging that great sadness that does exist in our work, and which you can't ignore really. And but even so doing, creating these installations, there is something of that kind of creativity there. And these memorials we set up once a year when we publish our findings from the data gathering process that we go through, the submissions gathering process where people submit memorials and tributes, but we also send freedom of information requests. And this is a very technical, very sort of almost bureaucratic process where we're gathering huge amounts of information. And where is the humanity in all of that? Well, it comes at this point where we share information more widely with the public. That moment of remembrance is really important, and that time for people to come together and share. And this year we held our vigil outside Downing Street and had a good couple of hours of people sharing whatever they wanted to that year. And we had people from all walks of life come along to that vigil and talk about this issue, right, and talk about what had happened. So that is an example of how you can learn how we have done this and approached this.
So we had, in the beginning, we had the joy of Secret Museum, and then we've rounded off with our most poignant moment of the year, where we do sit together in grief. And so it's being alongside each other in all of those emotional spaces that's really important. And the final thing we wanted to just finish with, so a sort of some of the things that we think is really important for policy to include, if we are to really address homelessness. As one of our crew said, that's an oxymoron, address homelessness. But if we really are to create decent solutions, we do believe there are a couple of problems with policy that don't allow people to be present together and to do that proper healing. And it's based in, like, let's not forget community. Let's not be too individualized. So we think that the move on culture, there is in England, certainly where we operate, there can be in services this need to move people on really quickly. Like in our community, some people moved on in 2 weeks, some people moved on in 2 months, some in 2 years, and some lived and died with us. And we have to have space and flexibility in services for some people to stay in community for as long as they need to, even if that's for the rest of their life. And I just don't see much of that space at the moment. And we always flag that because it comes back to that being present together and really healing together. And then the other thing is that we think that the housing first and the rapid rehousing is really brilliant, and everyone should have the right to a decent home, and they must. However, what we're seeing this in the private rental sector, particularly conversions into studios that take out any opportunity for communal space. And we think, let's just not forget the communal aspect of this healing. Let's not close day centres and not reopen them from COVID. Let's not completely do away with spaces where people can just be together and be present together. We just think that that's a really important thing in the journey out of homelessness. Let's, even if people are housed on their own, which is great and may well be what a lot of people need, but making sure there's opportunity for relationship and connection as well, because we see incredible loneliness in our work, and particularly in the findings of the Dying Homeless Project. Loneliness is one of the biggest problems. So that was what we wanted to end in that, really, in these images here of our community and the community of LGBTIQ outside the Outside Project and Streets Kitchen and all our grassroots partners who where we've had this incredible opportunity to connect and to be together and to look after each other. And that is probably where I will end now. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening, everyone. Try my camera.
Thank you both. That was absolutely fantastic. I've been waiting a long time to hear from you, and it was even better than I expected. So thank you so much for such honesty, for such consideration, for such diversity in what you talked about, and the combination of the realism, but also the hope and the optimism and the creativity as well. I thought that was a fantastic presentation. We have a few questions that have come in, but feel free to submit any more using the chat button. Jess, I think you spoke about acceptance, and so how important is it to accept people for who they are, for all the things that they bring with them, and to try and avoid forcing people to change before we allocate them a home. It's something that we're thinking about at the moment with rapid rehousing, about this concept of judging whether someone's housing ready before we're willing to make them an offer, and actually trying to be much more person-centered and accepting people and not putting preconditions on people for what should be a human right.
Yeah, brilliant. That's music to my ears. Like, go Wales. And I know that it's been pioneering in Scotland as well. So yeah, basically, if we think about it, like, how could we possibly force healing? Like, how can conditionality or enforcement or any of those things help people heal? So the magic happens when people are accepted exactly as they are. And certainly for me, until I found a full acceptance for my whole self and all of my history, not having to hide anything about it and finding the strength in that, that's where the healing happens. So yeah, that's definitely going to be the way that people will heal, be more likely to heal. It has to be on the person's terms, doesn't it? It's just not going to work otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've both talked a lot about the impact of trauma, and that's something that we try and talk a lot about in the sector and in Cumorth, and try and make sure is reflected as much as possible in policy and service delivery. But how important is it that it's not only about the service provision and that about support workers being trauma informed, but also commissioners of services, leaders within organisations, about setting that culture and creating a trauma-informed environment so that support workers can operate within that.
Yeah. Matt, do you want to?
This is a really big question, I think, because I think if you're a commissioner, you're working within a statutory framework, which can mean that someone who is going through the system has the rug pulled out from under them, quite frankly, and that can happen quite easily. So I think it's really essential for commissioners to broaden the types of organisations that they work with, in a sense, so that people just aren't funneled through a kind of mechanistic, bureaucratic process. So I always refer to the work of Public Interest Law Centre, who call for a rights-based approach within services. And I think that's really important, because someone's journey could literally be undone if they're given a piece of paper not in their own language and they're expected to fill it out because the support worker's too busy or whatever, and then something happens and a deadline isn't met. And it's those sorts of processes that often exist when people are moving through the system, which are not trauma informed, which can actually have a huge impact on a person's life. We're all very different, and things affect us in different ways, and particularly bring trauma into that because of its overall effect. So I think it's commissioners thinking about the diversity of groups and people that they are bringing into the conversations around how they allocate the often limited resources they have. And I know that doesn't give you all the answers. That's like a practice. We see that in a borough we're hoping to work in more, and even have our own building in Haringey, where they've co-produced their rough sleeping strategy through arts-based processes, working with Arts and Homelessness International, to kind of put arts and culture at the centre of their approach. Because in terms of rights to culture is actually also in the Declaration of Human Rights. So it's trying to do things like that, and carry on that. A lot of good work like that happened in the pandemic, and continuing that. And it's hard, but if we can continue to try and think in that way, then I think we can make some progress. So there's a lot more you could say about that, but yeah,
absolutely. We could be here for days, couldn't we? But the role of art and creativity comes through really strongly in the work of the museum. And I guess one of the things that we've seen over the past 10, 15 years, particularly through austerity, is a lot of the funding stripped back for arts and community and creativity, and actually the benefits of it people I don't think recognise enough, and that's certainly something that you've seen, isn't it? And what would your kind of words be on advocating for that approach, using creativity and art and the benefits it could bring?
Yeah, I would say definitely explore partnership. So basically, Amgueddfa Cymru have done really good National Museums Wales, a good long period of partnership with Wallach, where people curated a show called Who Decides at the National Museum in Cardiff. I think they did a long project at St Fagans as well. So, museums have been cut as well. Homelessness services have been cut, and the wider arts has been cut. But if you come together, I think there's a real will on both sides to make it work. So I definitely advocate for partnerships between arts organisations and homelessness organisations. I think you can get some really powerful work done together with quite limited resources.
Definitely.
I just to add a quick point to that. I think in a changing world, like the world we're in now, arts and cultural organisations and museums are really rethinking the way that they work and their relevance, really, and that's becoming more civic minded is a huge part. And we've seen a lot of work happening between big museum services, cultural organisations, and sectors like the homelessness sector, where new sorts of partnerships and collaborations are formed, and it's really heartening to see a lot of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, we talk about being more trauma informed within the sector and trying to show that compassion and kindness. But we know that, there's a real issue, I think, at times with the general public and their perception of what homelessness is, the causes of it, and their perception of people experiencing it. And, how important is it for you in the work with the museum to try and help to change those attitudes and maybe reduce that stigma and educate people in the wider community about this issue?
Yeah, that's one of our key strategic aims. So we want to make change for institutions. So we do want to do the institutional education, the commissioners, etc., that you just mentioned, but also the wider public. We are trying to do that, and that's why we needed to get evidence for the work. That's why I went to work with Lasana, because we were curious, genuinely. Anyone who works in the arts will say, we're like, oh, it really changes people's perceptions and that connection happens, etc. But we wanted the science to evidence it. And the work with Lasana was so interesting because it does literally change people's neural responses just hearing an object story, So we want to do more of that. We were in the pandemic, we obviously had to just change everything and stop all of that creative work just to do a year of emergency. But we're back on it now, and hopefully we'll be able to do more influencing of people who have a certain perception of people who are homeless.
Just to say about that process with Lasana Harris, I mean, there's something about the way way people go through that experience. So the framing of it. So people didn't come to that exhibition where we had Lasana's theories and work and kind of hear about them or read about them on a text panel or something like that. They were asked to fill in a questionnaire. So the onus was immediately placed upon the visiting audience to kind of consider their own preconceptions and ideas about things, as opposed to kind of having a space to air their own ideas about homelessness. It was immediately, oh, let me just consider this, but then have my opportunity to share. So it's about kind of how do you subvert the normal platforms that people have to talk about and debate homelessness? That's why we did with Secret Museum, we just put it outdoors and said you have to find it, because it is changing the platform that people have to kind of discuss the issues
through the experience. So with Objectified, which we did with Lasana, we made we funneled everyone into a sort of DWP style waiting room and made them have an uncomfortable experience. Bless them. We never try and recreate the experience of homelessness, because you can't, but we try and give people a sense of a little taste of some of the emotions that people might have. And the other thing I'd like to say on that is just that it's really important for the homelessness sector as well to help with not perpetuating stereotypes. So basically, some of the images that are best for fundraising are worst for perpetuating stigma. So we would just put a plea to anyone who is in comms or fundraising for homelessness, just to have a think about that, the images and the messages that we put out, so that it helps change that societal norm.
100% agree with that. And for anyone in the audience who's not aware of the crisis frameworks research, that was some really big research into public perceptions and how we can better communicate about homelessness in order to increase people's understanding of the causes and also the solutions, because we know that there's a bunch of elected people making decisions about planning, about house building, about service provision, and often respond to some of the things they hear from their communities. And so the more we can do to educate communities, who then hopefully educate their elected members, and maybe some better decisions get made that help us to reach that goal. We're increasing a focus here in Wales about trying to make sure that we're empowering people with lived experience to meaningfully influence policy and practice. And obviously you've got a real strength of engaging with people with your lived experience, and also throughout the work of the museum and the broader groups that you work with. What are the sorts of kind of tips that you would give to any organisations who are looking to further develop that engagement with lived experience about how they should approach it and how they can make it most meaningful?
Good. That's a good question. Have the money conversation. So money's really important. Like, some people won't want to be paid or need to be paid, or actually can't be paid because of benefit situation. But others might rightly expect to be like properly paid, and not a lot of the guys are like, oh, £10 voucher again. It feels very tokenizing. So ask people. I would try and ask people about involvement before you go for the funding, and so get people in at that design stage, and then it's more likely that people will feel properly involved and not tokenized and just labeled as lived experience. And the other thing would be try and do, we never, it's not possible to get this completely right, and we don't get it completely right by any means, but try and be as unfiltered as possible so when people give their experience or whatever, in whatever way it is, try not to edit, because people do notice that, don't they, and rightly get annoyed.
100%, yeah.
So there's that. Anything else, Matt?
Well, I think unfiltering is about not modelling, over modelling an approach, I suppose. Sort of saying we do things in this particular way of peer-led way, for example. Actually, I think we recently looked at the sort of different approaches we've taken, and it's like 6 or 7 different sort of models that we have for engagement. And the reason why that is because what we actually ended up producing, be it an exhibition or the vigil that we talked about earlier, it's not really a set defined process you can go through. It's a sort of relational, reciprocal experience where something gets kind of created and emerged, and you can have that experience and be like, oh, that was sort of the model that we took, and really it was kind of created as you went. So kind of not preempting the process too much before you've gone into it is something we found really useful.
Yeah, basically think about we took this slide out, but I want to refer to it now. Think about mutual aid rather than charity extracting. So Museum of Homelessness, we always like, is this useful? Do the community want this? Etc. So it's making sure that what you're doing is useful and that is what people actually need and want, and then the rest is easier from there. So it's like the mutual aid, people taking care of each other rather than the more traditional charity model, I guess. That helps.
Definitely. And I think there's that thing, isn't it, about recognising the expertise, which, plays into that remuneration conversation as well, doesn't it? About, as much as we would, for anyone who's kind of, at a Welsh Government meeting as a professional, is probably getting paid for that and probably being respected as a professional. And actually, when we engage with people with lived experience, they are experts in those experiences, and they should be respected as such and recognised in that way as well.
Yeah, 100%.
100%.
Brilliant. Well, we're just coming to the end of the session. A huge thank you again to both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here at our conference, and hopefully we can keep the conversations going as we kind of come out of this pandemic period, and hopefully there'll be more opportunities for us to speak with each other and work together in the future. But we'll certainly be keeping an eye on all of your work and promoting it wherever we can. Thank you so much for your time, for your generosity, for your honesty, and your insight and expertise expertise. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I hope you're pleased with the answers that you've got. We've got one more session today, and that's going to be with Charlotte Waite, who has got a vast array of experience in the sector and outside, and she's going to be talking about public service innovation, mindset, culture and psychological safety. And I think there's going to be a lot about trauma and psychology in that, which runs really nicely with some of the themes we've talked about today. So diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much indeed, Jess and Matt. It's been lovely to see you, and we hope to see the rest of the audience at 2 o'clock. Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Katie. Bye. Thanks, everyone.